How's the sound? Is that all right? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, first, some gratitude. Thank you so much for everyone for coming out today. The sun is shining out there, so I appreciate you being indoors with me for a little bit. Thank you to the Alliance for the invitation to be here to share this work with you. And thank you to New York DEC for the permission to carry out this research in the park and for their stewardship of this significant cultural and natural resource. We were really welcomed by the park and by the Alliance, by DE staff and by the folks who were, Dick and others who were in the visitor center every day, and my team felt really welcome, so we very much appreciate that. Let's get on with it. So just over a year and a half ago, John Denuzzo, the president of the Alliance, reached out to me to ask if I would be interested in discussing some possibilities for archaeological research at the Lake George Battlefield State Park. John mentioned the important work of David Starbuck and the Alliance's interest in continuing the research that David began 2 decades ago until his passing in 2020. Shortly after that, I met up with John, Chuck Vandry of DEC, and several Alliance board members to walk the park and talk about how archaeological research might fit into the stewardship goals of DEC and the Alliance. Archaeology in the park offers an opportunity to learn more about the lives of people in this place that witnessed important moments in American history. Archaeology helps us learn more about more than the battles and military strategy. It gives us a window into the daily lives in a military camp in the 1700s. It's also a useful tool for stewardship, and it can be used to assess the below-ground cultural resources that are present within the park so that we can avoid disturbing them in the future. Until I met with Chuck, John, and the Alliance, I only knew of David Starbuck's work generally. While my work is also grounded in the Northeast, I focus primarily on indigenous experiences of early colonialism up through the American Revolution, and I'm not a military archaeologist. I met David Starbuck once in person at a doctoral defense in 2018. It was a dissertation that focused on Revolutionary War monuments in New York State, and David's vast knowledge of the revolutionary landscape and historical detail was evident in his pointed questions and comments. I felt a little uncomfortable for the student who was defending at a few moments there, but David was right. He was on point and he was pushing where he needed to push. As archaeologists, David and I shared an interest in learning about people's experiences in the past through the debris of their lives, the things that people left behind, the things they forgot or threw away, as well as the places that people lived, worked, and experienced their day-to-day lives. With hindsight, we know that these were extraordinary times when we think about the times that people were living and working at the Lake George battlefield. Over the last year, I've gotten to know aspects of David Starbuck through his material proxies, the things that he left behind, the products of his archaeology at Lake George, photos, site maps, artifact catalogs, notes, reports, articles. I've also gotten to know about David through the stories of those who worked directly with him. And this was one of the things that I very much appreciated about my time working in the park last summer. Here you see him as you see his shadow as he stands behind the camera during field work in the park. And this is a kind of classic thing for any project director. You're rarely in the photos, especially the photos of site. You're almost always behind the camera. So when I came across this photo from David's archive of 2015 excavation photos, which was actually given to me by Chuck Vandry about a year ago, I realized, oh, there's David's sort of imprint, and he's still there in the work as it continues. Over 2 decades, Starbuck conducted intensive field research, trained students, and cultivated a community of avocational archaeologists and historians in the park. Building on this legacy, I initiated new research in the park in 2024 using ground penetrating radar and limited excavation. And this is what I'll talk about today. While this new work takes a different approach than David used in terms of method, we are guided by Starbuck's commitment to advance the knowledge and preservation of this significant place and to continue to cultivate that stewardship ethic. So first, some context. As most of you know, the Lake George Battlefield State Park is a 35-acre park located on the southern end of Lake George. The relatively newly constructed visitor center gives us a nice center point when you look at the aerial view. I noticed that the pathway around the visitor center sort of draws your eye to that part of the park. The park contains the remains of 25 years of military action and encampment spanning the French and Indian War through the American Revolution. I'm an archaeologist and not a historian, so I turn to the subject experts like historian Russ Bellico for historical context. His book, Empires in the Mountains, is a great resource and one that I've relied on. And the recent work of other historians and avocational historians like Alliance member Mark Silo, who's been working on reconstructing the battle lines from historical descriptions and maps. So I'm not a subject expert in the details of the history. I'm going to give you the abbreviated version for broader context. In the summer of 1755, General William Johnson ordered construction of Fort William Henry for the British to assert their control over the southern shoreline of Lake George, the primary portage between Lake George and the Hudson River, and the direct link between Canada and the British American colonies. In September, the French attacked to wrest control of Lake George from the British in the conflict that became known as the Battle of Lake George. British and Native American allies pushed the French back after establishing battle lines, but the exact on-the-ground locations are unknown. Primary source descriptions include contemporary maps, like the so-called Blodgett map that you see here on the slide, that show the Battle of Lake George extended from the area around Fort George, the British left flank, around the bottom part of the slide, to the west, the top part of the map, which was the British right flank. And I'll just note here, if you go to the Massachusetts Historical Society and search for this map, they have a really great interactive feature where you can zoom in, pan over different parts of the map, and really explore the details of it. So I'd recommend taking a look at that when you have some time. Within the park, there are likely the remains of multiple hospitals from both the French and Indian War and Revolutionary War era. In 1758, a stockaded post was built with an L-shaped hospital to take care of sick soldiers and in anticipation of the future wounded. In 1759, construction of Fort George began, along with a new picket fort, a hospital that replaced the L-shaped building, which had been intentionally destroyed. This map here comes from 1759 and shows the picket fort. The picket fort on the right side, picket fort, as well as barracks and a kitchen area. Over the next few years, Fort William Henry was completed nearby, and barracks, hospitals, and other military infrastructure were built there and at Fort George. These forts and hospitals became critical for the Continental Army when many soldiers caught smallpox in 1776 after the failed Battle of Quebec. Fort George was of limited defensive use, so General Schuyler built hospitals to take care of the sick and wounded from Ticonderoga. The area became home to the largest smallpox hospitals in the American colonies, with several thousand patients. Starbuck was curious about the location of the smallpox hospitals, having previously researched one at Rogers Island in Fort Edward. He proposed that maybe here at Fort George, smallpox patients were cared for in barracks buildings like those that you see on the map here. And this is something that we'll come back to later. As Peter Rubin and John mentioned, in 1898, the area was purchased by the state of New York to become a park for recreation and a memorial to battles fought and to soldiers who died on this land. Today, the park is stewarded by DEC and includes monuments, memorials, and the intact remains of archaeological features, including the Fort George Bastion, the 1758 and 1759 stockade and entrenchments, officer huts, soldier barracks, and lime kilns. It's used as a campground and day-use picnic area with walking trails, interpretive signage, and the recently established visitor center with exhibition. The story of the land told in the park's visitor center features many of the artifacts that were recovered by Starbuck's team. Between 2000 and 2015, Starbuck directed 5 seasons of investigation at the park through field schools sponsored by SUNY Adirondack. This work is synthesized in a chapter in his book, Archaeology in the Adirondacks, The Last Frontier, which was published in 2018, and in Archaeology in the Lake George Battlefield Park, which he completed in 2020, a few months before he died. Starbuck described the aim of these investigations as recovering information that would help visitors better understand the exact locations of the park's many occupations and battles over a 25-year period, and especially wanting to differentiate between the French and Indian War occupation and the later American Revolution occupation. Over 5 seasons of fieldwork, Starbuck's team researched several barracks areas, including the so-called Picket Fort at the northern end of the park. In 2015, the team focused on the remains of Fort George. So I've labeled, this is the map that comes from Starbuck's 2020 report, and you can see in the northern end, he's investigated several areas where there were barracks buildings, as well as the existing bastion of Fort George. This included, the investigations of Fort George included well-mortared stone walls and below-ground cellar rooms. He continued this work, or started this work in 2015, continued in 2016, which was his last season of fieldwork at the park, and focused on interior barracks and a large area on the western side of the Fort George Road that contained a large refuse pit feature. And I'm also going to come back to that at the end. Starbuck isn't the only archaeologist who's worked in the park. It's important to recognize the work that was done by Curtin Associates, Ed Curtin and team, who conducted a cultural resource management survey at the park in 2001. And Ed was working on the south side of the bastion. There was also a comprehensive cultural resource inventory prepared by Hart Archaeological Associates in 2018 for the town of Lake George, and that includes some really useful information about the cultural resources in the park. And there are parts of that report that are publicly available. So, when we began new work in June 2024, it was first important to build relationships with the people and organizations who were active in the parks of DEC and the Alliance, and really just to get a sense of the physical landscape, both above ground and below ground. So understanding the topography, the vegetation, the stratigraphy, the geology, these were all things that I was new to the place, and so really needed to establish that familiarity. And that's something that's in a cumulative process, continues. Our research questions were broadly focused on the French and Indian War battle lines and Revolutionary War era smallpox hospitals. And so we were focusing on the two areas that are outlined here on the slide. In Area 1, on the northern end of the park, investigating barracks and possible smallpox hospitals, and then in the southern area of the park, investigating the battle lines of the Battle of Lake George. We were also interested in determining whether a technique like ground penetrating radar would be an effective tool in the park. So we focused first on Area 1, and then we moved in our last week to Area 2. Over 3 weeks in June, we conducted a largely non-invasive investigation of these two areas. We spent about half of our time collecting the ground penetrating radar data and mapping, and the other half of our time excavating a pretty small area. And my approach is a survey more, dig less approach. This is an approach that is, mindful of the fact that cultural resources are limited, and given that the park's cultural resources are very well protected by the stewardship of DEC, and that there are existing collections of, tens of thousands of artifacts previously excavated from the park, and that data is extensive, we can really be much more deliberate in what we do to disturb those archaeological resources. So I was assisted by two Skidmore College anthropology students, and we were joined by volunteers who were coordinated by the Alliance, including several folks that had worked previously with David Starbuck, either here at the park or at other sites like Rogers Island. So here on the slide, you see our team and Alliance member Larry Handy. I don't know if Larry is Larry Handy? No. This was on the day of the hollowing of the ground ceremony last June, and so Larry was portraying Peter Gansford for that. So what did we do? I've mentioned ground penetrating radar, and I'll just do a really quick tutorial on what that is. Our primary method for non-invasive survey was using ground penetrating radar, which is a method that uses electromagnetic pulses to create images of changes below the surface. So the GPR, let's see if I can take this on the road. So this is our GPR rig here. I'll just use this graphic to explain the parts. So there's an antenna. That antenna is both sending out, sending out and receiving those electromagnetic, those radio waves, right? So sending them out, receiving them. There's a computer that's processing that information about how long and what the strength of those waves are when they're returning to the antenna. And it's processing all of that. It's creating an image that you can see on the screen, but it's also capturing all of that data for processing later. So our rig looks like this. Here's the antenna. It's connected to that tablet here, which is processing all of the data and has a screen that we can sort of see in real time what we're looking at. It's all on this is kind of a modified jogger stroller, which is kind of as rugged as you can get with this. So the antenna is fine as long as it's in contact with the ground. And this is an antenna that you can use this on ice, you can use it, in pretty rugged terrain. As long as it's kind of constantly in contact with the ground surface, it's good. It's a hard upper body workout to kind of control the whole rig when you're going, you really get familiar with the micro topography of the surface that you're moving across. And then this is all tied into, that's our GPS unit on top, which is recording locations with 1 to 2 centimeter accuracy. So pretty, way better than GPS on your phone in your pocket. So the antenna is sending out waves, and it's sending out those waves, thousands of them per second. The waves are pushing deeper into the subsurface until it encounters some kind of change in property. It could be that there's, something there. There's a rock, there's a pipe. GPR is used in the construction industry, right? It's used to locate where there's rebar in a wall. It's used to locate buried electrical lines. It's used for a variety of purposes. Archaeologists use it to look for buried features. So it's used a lot in locating unmarked graves, right? Where there's some kind of a difference. There could be buried coffin. It could just be the difference in the water content of the soil. It could be the bedrock, right? So any kind of difference is going to change the nature of that wave that's being sent out from the antenna. And when that wave returns to the antenna and the computer are processing that change in velocity. So the computer processes the strength and time of the wave as it is returning to the machine, and it's capturing all of that data, recording it so that we can then go and take a look at it after the fact. This is the graphic that comes from a workshop that I did with some colleagues from a firm that does geophysics for archaeology. So you can see, just a sense of what that's like, pushing it along the surface, right, along a transect here. The waves are being sent out and returned, and different kinds of materials are going to send different kinds of signal reflections back. It's not an X-ray. It doesn't give us an image of what's below the surface, but it gives us data that we can then interpret to try to figure out what is likely below the surface. So we surveyed 680 square meters in the northern part of the park that we were working in Area 1, where we were looking for barracks and the possible smallpox hospitals. We collected data in two directions, so both north, south, and east, west. And let me see, I think I have the next slide. Yeah. So here you can see the Johnson Hendricks monument here, right? This is the road is on the other side. This is sort of a circle, a loop at the northern end of the park, and we were working within that loop. And maybe you can see these blue lines, right? There's a blue line there, a blue line here, and then these alternating red lines. Those are our lanes. Those are, that's how we keep ourselves going in a straight, in this case, east-west direction to collect that data. So the student is pushing the GPR along the surface, walking towards that cone to keep on that straight line, keeping within those lanes. And then just collecting, first transect, second transect, third transect, and so forth. This is what a radargram looks like. This is what the radargram looks like, not on the screen as you're reading it, but after we've downloaded the data back in the lab and spent a whole lot of time processing. So applying different filters, amplifying different signals, just using what we know to really fine-tune the image. So what you're seeing here along this axis is the ground surface. So those little hash marks are just meter marks. So 2 meters, 4 meters, and so forth. And then this is depth, right? So what we're looking for when we're interpreting a GPR radargram, we're looking for anything that has this kind of hyperbolic shape, right? You can see it's kind of got a, 2 tails and comes to sort of a point here, and then you see some different colors, the dark and the light. Those hyperbola are the indications of some kind of point reflection. It's something that the GPR is, there's a wave, many thousands of waves coming out and returning back from a single point. And they look like this on the radargram because you're detecting it as you're moving across the surface, right? Those waves are coming out like a flashlight beam in a cone, right? So as you're moving across the surface, even though this is probably the point where this object is, you're detecting it, the machine is setting up the cone like this, it's detecting it here, 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 right? And so in the image, it renders it like in this shape, this hyperbola shape. So what we're interested in when we look at these, we're interested in those places where we see those hyperbola. Those hyperbola it's something, right? The radargram doesn't tell you what it is. It just tells you that there's something that's different there. And it could be a whole range of things, right? It could be field stone. It could be a metal artifact. It could be, if you were in an area where there were power lines, maybe you're crossing a power line, right? And that's where the excavation comes into play. That's where, to ground truth it, to know what we're looking at, we do need to do some ground disturbance. But we can gain a lot of information from, looking at these radargrams and looking at the patterns of these anomalies and using what we know from historic maps, using what we know from past archaeology and from ground truthing to then, say something, to offer some interpretations. So this takes a lot of time just to process each of the radargrams. I think we had something like 200, maybe 250 individual transects. And then we turn them into the amplitude slice maps. So very colorful, right? It's I find it pleasing to look at. What this is here, this is like you're looking bird's eye view down on the area that we surveyed. So we have one 20-meter block here, and then our second 20-meter, it's like 20 by 14 meter block here. This is showing you all of our transects. So those green lines, we start here, right, walk to here. We come back here, do our next one. And anywhere there's white is an area where there was some kind of obstruction, so we couldn't, push the cart up and over it. There were a bunch of trees in that that were just too hard to navigate through. Over here, there's a grill, right? It's a day-use campground, so there's a metal grill, and we could get that close to it and then had to stop and start on the other side of the transect. So you're seeing the bird's eye view of the data that we collected there, and then this is a kind of heat map of where the GPR picked up some kind of difference, and we're looking at the depth of 35 centimeters. So at 35 centimeters below the surface, I don't know, something like this, what we're seeing, these little reds, the reds and the yellows are where there's kind of maximum difference between what the GPR was reading at that point and everything around it, right? So those are the things that we were being attentive to, looking at those areas as places where there could be artifacts or artifact concentrations, or just something that was anomalous from what was surrounding it. So we used this amplitude, or these kinds of amplitude maps to then target where we were going to do some excavation, right? And what we decided, and you'll see this in a few maps, is to focus on this area where we had a few anomalies in a pretty small area, and then up here, this one was just particularly interesting because it's a little bit bigger. And it was adjacent to this area where we had a lot of anomalies as well. There were some obstructions, the bedrock is really shallow in this area, so there were other factors that contributed to us focusing here and here. And David had worked in this area before, on the western side of Area 1, and I'm still not exactly sure where on the ground his test units are, so I was hesitant to I didn't want to use our time and redig soil that had already been dug through and screened. So we focused on that, the eastern part of the area that we did the GPR. After we did the survey and the radargram analysis, we located where all of those anomalies were, and there were, maybe 2 days that whole area was full of these little white pin flags, right? Because we wanted to see in real space what those concentrations looked like, and to see if we saw any patterning that looked important. We also mapped all of them with our GPS, and you can see those are here on the map as well. And that was what helped us to make our determination of where we were going to excavate. So we put in 3 test units. We started with 2, this one here and one here, and then we did an expansion of the one over here, just to sort of try to make sense of what we were seeing. So in 2 of our, here you see some of our team members, Lily Weldon, Larry Handy, and Joanne Morrison. I know Joanne is here. We're excavating in Area 1, so in that northern part of the park in June. What we found in that area was very shallow bedrock. So you can see that here, right? The bedrock is, in some places, just a few centimeters below the surface. But you can see there are these very large crevices in the bedrock. So here, this is like a bird's eye view looking straight down. The shallowest depth, around here is 10 centimeters below the surface, and then that gets all the way down to 60 or 70 centimeters here. So those crevices are quite deep, and in some places, pretty broad. And what we found in these 2 contiguous units was bedrock with crevices that were filled in with flat rocks and mortar. And beneath this were fragments of medium-sized mammal bone. This is an area that, on the GPR, we were probably seeing these voids, these big air pockets on the GPR, and those gaps were what were showing up on the radargrams as opposed to groups of artifacts. Some of the kinds of things that we found in these 2 contiguous test units included very common 18th century artifacts like tin glazed earthenware, delft, and some other types that we could identify to the late 17th and into the 18th century. There were glass wine bottle shards, which you see on the far right, and then a bunch of butchered animal bone. So animal bone that was clearly cut, right? So cut in preparation in food preparation. It appears that the limestone bedrock was being used as some kind of living surface, either interior or exterior, and that the crevice areas were filled in as a way of leveling off the floor surface. So that's at least my hypothesis. It appears that filling was quite intentional to create a level surface, and that the animal bone may have been intentionally disposed of in these crevices, or maybe were just unintentionally swept into the crevice as part of kind of the general maintenance of these floor spaces, whether it was an interior barracks floor space or kitchen space or exterior space. So it looks to me like this area may have been a floor that was adjacent to the 2 long barracks areas and the kitchen area that was shown on that 1759 brazier map. This mortared limestone is consistent with what Starbuck's team found when he was excavating the 1759 barracks buildings inside the stockaded fort. And the material culture is similar to what Starbuck found in this area. Brick fragments, mortar, hand-wrought nails, creamware, ceramics, other stonewares, wine bottle fragments. Starbuck found musket balls, gun flints. We did not find any clearly military items. Butchered bone fragments, and then the modern trash that's also there. This is a plan view of the other test unit that we excavated in Area 1. And again, your looking bird's eye view, kind of top down. And you can see that there are a lot of stones, right? Big and small stones in this area. This is an area that appeared to be, was a large deposit of butchered animal bones. That was beneath a pile of field stone. And I know from reading David's records that it was reported to him that the area was used to gather and deposit field stones more recently, maybe as part of park maintenance. But beneath that was, again, a pretty large deposit of animal bone, including a number of domesticated species. So there's pig in there, there's some sheep. There's also very clearly butchering. So, I mean, this is a rib, right? And this is a nice little rib bite here. And you can see some failed cuts there as well. So pretty classic butchering. Overall, the artifacts that we found in this Area 1 indicate 18th century domestic use that would be consistent with barracks, kitchen, food preparation, food consumption, and disposal practices. The 3 test units in Area 1 yielded no direct evidence that this area was used to house smallpox patients. At the smallpox hospital that David excavated on Rogers Island, his team recovered glass vial shards, bandage pins, medicine cup shards, things that are more directly associated with the care of the sick. We didn't find anything definitively medical. That ceramic shard that I showed you a few slides ago, Delft is a type that was used for lots of different things, from kitchenware to chamber pots to medicine cups, and this shard is just too small to say whether, could it have been a medicine cup? Yeah, but I wouldn't say for certain that is an indication of the care of the sick. But the evidence of 18th century domestic activities is pretty clear, and so we know that this area was where the activities of the day-to-day life of soldiering took place, and that undoubtedly included caring for the sick. When we moved up to Area 2, down to south to Area 2, to investigate the battle lines of the Battle of Lake George, when you do a site walkover in March and then return in June, the landscape can look a little different. So, we thought that we were going to be able to use GPR in that area, but it would have taken a fair amount of clearing to get a wide enough, there was just a lot of undergrowth. So we decided that our time was better used choosing 3 areas for testing with, again, small 1 meter by 1 meter test units. We didn't find definitive evidence of the battle lines in this area, but we did recover evidence of land use from the 18th century through the present, including a plow zone, which, archaeologists are maybe the only people that get excited about a plow zone, but it does tell you that the area was used for agricultural purposes sometime after the Revolutionary War. Unlike Area 1, most of what we found in this area, Area 2, was architectural with just a small amount of domestic material. So you can see here, these are to orient you, these are the park maintenance buildings here, and the road, Fort George Road is here. So we were in the wooded area just off the road. If you were headed, this will take you to the campground if you head in that way. So we just chose 3 locations for our 1x1 test units in there. The artifacts that we recovered in the plow zone were a mix of modern refuse and 18th and 19th century materials. So we found whiteware, ceramics, redware like the shirt you see here, other glazed earthenwares. We did find a single utilized chert flake, which is an indication of the long history of indigenous land use here on the shores of Lake George. A shard of hand-blown bottle glass, which you see here, may date to the 18th century, and that was recovered at the base of the plow zone. So when we're digging, in our layers, controlled layers, down, and we hit the bottom of the plow zone into a kind of intact, probably 18th century deposit. We found this piece of bottle glass. Ed Curtin's excavations on the east side of Fort George Road recovered evidence of direct conflict. Ed's team found musket balls, gun flints, other arms, though it wasn't clear whether those were from the French and Indian War or later use. We didn't find any direct evidence of battle lines or any kind of military conflict in this area. I think that one thing to look at, and this is something that, the individual artifacts are interesting and can tell stories on their own, but when we group them together and take a kind of broader look and do some comparison, we also see some different kinds of patterns. So in this chart, when we're in the lab, we're cataloging the artifacts individually, and then we're, what are they? And then thinking about how they were used. So what are their functional categories? So when we group artifacts by functional categories and compare what we found in the northern area, area 1, to what we found in the southern area, area 2, we see some interesting differences. One, just overall quantities of material. Because we excavated 3 units in the north and 3 units in the south, so roughly the same volume of soil. But in the northern area, we found much more material overall, and most of it was related to domestic activity, to food consumption, preparation, and so forth. And that was quite different from what we found in that southern area, where we found just a little bit related to food consumption and preparation and other domestic activities. Most of it was architectural, related to buildings that post-date the Revolutionary War. An important part of what we did last summer and that we're committed to continuing to do was public engagement. This was really enhanced through the partnership with the Alliance and due to the visibility of our work in the park. We were able to engage with people on their own, folks that are just doing their daily walk through the park, or folks that had intentionally visited to learn about the history of the place. There were school groups. I remember Dick giving a tour to a school group from the school that my son goes to, and having 50 third or fourth graders watch what we were doing. And then we were able to do some formal programming, and that included a New York State Path Through History event where we did a demo of the ground penetrating radar, and where the students that I was working with did some interpretation at the excavation site. The Alliance produced press releases and coordinated media visits, which was very helpful, because when excavations are taking place, there's a lot going on, a lot of moving pieces, so that was really helpful and welcome. And I have to say, one of the things I was really impressed by was how well-versed the local media was in issues of preservation, stewardship, and particularly around the New York State burial laws and protections given to unmarked burials and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I've worked in a lot of places and engaged with a lot of local media folks, and I've never had such informed questions as I have had from the folks who work in this area. So what's next? We didn't find direct evidence of 18th century smallpox hospitals or British battle-ons. Archaeology is an accumulative research endeavor, and rarely do we, find, the amazing thing when we're beginning a project. It really is about an accumulation of data and knowledge. We did find substantial 18th century activity in Area 1. And moving forward, I'm committed to this survey more, dig less approach. One of the things that we're beginning work on is research on the existing collection. So all of those seasons of field work that David did and that some other archaeologists have done are at the New York State Museum. And so recently I've entered into an agreement with the New York State Museum for a temporary loan of just a small subset of those collections so that students at Skidmore can work to recatalog those artifacts as a way of making them more accessible for research. So that's something that we're working on this semester through a class that I'm teaching at Skidmore, and hopefully that pilot will grow into something bigger. The proposal that I intend to submit to DEC and to the state archaeologist is to explore additional areas of the park with GPR and other non-invasive geophysical methods. I'm particularly interested in an area on the west side of Fort George Road. So if you remember back to the beginning, one of the areas that Starbucks team worked on in 2015 and 2016 was on the west side of Fort George Road. It's the area that slopes down to the lake shoreline, and so it's wide open, sparsely treed, so it's a kind of big clear area. It's broad and clear, so it lends itself to GPR survey. It's also a highly visible area, so it gives lots of opportunities for public engagement. David's team worked there in 2016 and found a large trash midden deposit, and he thought that it was from a 1760s headquarter post mixed with some earlier and later materials. And David called this feature, quote, the most extensive domestic dumping ever observed within the park. Which, I don't know, does that excite you? It excites me. That seems like, yes, please. He wasn't able to determine the boundaries of the feature. They excavated, I don't know, maybe 20 1 or 2 meter square test units, and didn't come down on the edge of this feature. But with GPR, I think it's possible to do that. And we may be able to determine not only the edge of this feature, which is something that is a resource that we want to protect, but also whether there are the remains of other refuse deposits, encampments, huts, or other features within that field. So that's something that, in terms of planning and stewardship of the park, I think we can contribute to with this geophysics combined with sort of limited excavation for ground truthing. In 2018, David wrote that the battlefield park is slowly coming into its own as a truly major military attraction on Lake George, and it has survived so well because the Department of Environmental Conservation, local residents, and most recently the Fort George Alliance have worked extremely hard to protect its integrity and ensure that modern development does not disturb the exciting ruins. The ruins and artifacts must be preserved so that those who come after us will have the same opportunity to understand what an 18th century military encampment looks like. Archaeology at the battlefield offers not only an opportunity to learn more about the lives of people in this place that is important to American history, but also the opportunity to share the knowledge that comes from archaeology more widely. One of Starbuck's lasting legacies, and I would argue Chuck Vandry's lasting legacies too, is the appreciation for preservation, public land, history, and archaeology. And both of them cultivated this amongst the people that they worked with. And my intention is to hopefully contribute in some small way to the continuation of that ongoing work. With gratitude to all of the folks that contributed to this, and hopefully more folks contributing to it moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hart. Just one footnote to what she said. As we did last year, once the schedule is known and once the approval is received from the state to do this year's archaeology, we will publicize that and offer volunteer opportunities as we did last year. So we will, we're blessed by a number of outstanding volunteers at the Alliance, and one of the best is Rob Sanasardo, who's also the president of the Friends of Crown Point. Rob is going to manage our question and answer with Professor Hart now. Rob?
Thank you, John. All right, so I'm going to open up the floor for questions, and I think the easiest way is we're going to start on my left, your right. So if anybody has any questions for Professor Hart, I'll come to you.
This is a question. Further down the hill where David dug, you saw some test pits, actually in that picture. He found a lot of indigenous sites further down there, so closer to the lake. So up there, up high, I mean, I was there, so I know. He did find that dump site, but then further down they found a lot of Native American indigenous sites, which is very consistent with what is found elsewhere.
All right. Question?
You mentioned the plow zone. How deep was that?
It's about so anywhere from 20 centimeters to 35 centimeters, depending on where you were. There was also a layer of hard pan, right? So like really compacted, like clay-like soil below that plow zone in that area. Which was, I don't know, Rob, I think you were one of the people digging through that. Not pleasant to dig through, but it gives you a nice clear horizon for that plow zone. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more on the left?
During your GPR work, was the picnic area included in that?
So when you say the picnic area, so we were just within
Fort George and say Route 9.
Between Fort George.
Well, picnic tables and the grills are.
So we were within the circle, right, the loop. Do you know what
Nothing outside the loop?
So we were only inside the loop, yep, and we moved the picnic table, we carry them out every day and then move them back. But that's why the one grill that we couldn't move.
Any plans to go outside the loop in that area?
Yeah, so what I'm proposing is to move to the other side of the Fort George Road, to move to the west side of the road and work in that larger open area. What we can do with that is, so what you saw were just two small grids stitched together, right? And if we have a big wide area, to see on those amplitude maps, locations of possible features, whether they're, French and Indian War, Revolutionary War, or earlier indigenous features, which, as Lynn pointed out, we're very likely to be able to find there. We can see a lot more. So that's why I'm inclined to go to a much larger area. This was a pilot, and when we did that walk in last March with Chuck and others, though within the circle seemed like a contained area that I could wrap my head around, starting the project and then working out from there.
Any more questions?
It seems to me that the park has a lot of trees, and I know you picked out little tiny meter areas, but is it possible to get a broader picture unless you clear more trees?
I mean, you can, with the GPR, actually the tree cover is less of an issue than the undergrowth, than the stuff that's growing, from the surface up, yeah. And that just makes it hard to push the cart through, or have the antenna in contact with the ground, because the antenna just needs to be on the ground. So I've done I work on a site that's on Skidmore campus, that's a 19th century site, and we have been doing GPR there, and it's all treed, and it's impossible. The challenge there is getting my GPR to work or my GPS to work, because it's not able to connect to the satellites with the tree canopy, but the GPR works fine. You can actually, you can do things with GPR like mapping tree root connections. I mean, there are environmental scientists who use GPR to look for the kind of the network of tree communities below the surface. Yeah. So it's not so much the trees as it is all that other invasive stuff that
The area that's gonna be potentially done next year on the other side of the road, where you're gonna dig, kind of definitively where the marshy area was before it hit solid ground?
I mean, I know from thinking about it in terms of maps. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So,
Yes.
A good portion of that was pretty wet though.
Yeah, and we also know that that area was used for parking previously. So it's there are areas that are pretty compacted. There are also power lines under. I think that David's team. There's a very nice picture of the top of a power line.
Yes.
Which also something that I would like to avoid, especially when working with students. So there are a lot of those kinds of things that will impact, when we I can draw a box on a map, but then there's the actually being there on the ground, and we also, it actually would be useful to go back over the area that David's team worked on, just to see what the back dirt looks like in comparison to the intact 18th century deposits. Yeah, and Lynn, all of the I think to your point, the indigenous history, to me, given my background, that to me is really important to recognize, record, and to contribute to the telling of the stories. And that area is, that's why we were so excited we found one flake, right? But seeing the projectile points and the debitage and other things that were found on that west side of the Fort George Road is
One more question, because I've been looking for the brick hill. That the lime hill is across the road, but the brick hill is over there, and I've been looking for the clay. You found the clay. Did you find any evidence of the brick hill that's over there?
no, sorry, not yet.
All right, we're gonna open up questions on the right side. Anybody have any questions on this side of the room? One in the back.
It's more of a comment, but I had the liberty of working under Dr. Starbuck, and I volunteered for the excavation in 2015 for Fort George. So we found a lot of iron rock stems and nails, and also baric activity. So I just wanted to thank you for capturing his character with David. He was often very funny and sarcastic at times, and he made the best blueberry pie. So I just wanted to capture his character so well.
Yeah, it's been somebody that I knew him in a kind of professional capacity, but not directly, aside from the one instance that I mentioned. But that has been something that through this work, and I think it's to me it's archaeology is science, but it's also it's a humanistic science, right? What we're interested really is that's like the maps I showed you are kind of like, for me, the extreme of the science piece for the archaeology that I do. It really is about archaeology is interdisciplinary and it's collaborative. And, the archaeologists themselves and the team that we form and the research that we do is as much about, the past as it is about the present moment, and kind of a shared concern for the continual telling of these stories and the keeping in historical memory, not only the people that we're researching, but also the people that we're working with. So.
Any more questions on this side? No?
Thank you, Professor Hart.